All right, so we can think of this as electron circulation. When we say circulation, we mean both the cardiovascular system and the lymphatic system. But I also use the term cardiovascular system to describe both of them as well. All right, so what is the cardiovascular system? It is the organ system that distributes blood to all parts of the body. All right, so it consists of the heart, uh, blood, and the vessels that carry that blood. Okay, so three components to the cardiovascular system. And as I said, its major function is to transport materials throughout the body. And that means, most importantly, that means nutrients, including oxygen. Okay, so oxygen and nutrients like glucose. And then, of course, as it's doing this, it's also picking up waste materials, for example, carbon dioxide, delivering carbon dioxide to the lungs where it gets expelled. So that's the major function. But on top of that, because the cardiovascular system and the blood interface with all parts of the body, it does a lot more than that. All right. It's responsible for distributing hormones throughout the blood, throughout the body. So it's part of the endocrine system. It's responsible for delivering immune cells. So it's part of the immune system as well. And it's also important for digestion and temperature regulation and a whole host of things. Interestingly, the ancients used to believe that the heart was really the center of our emotional and intellectual bodies. All right. We used to think of the heart as the center. And that's not surprising, right? Because when you get excited or when you get emotional, your heart starts beating faster. All right. So when things change in your environment, or if you're under stress, you really feel it in your heart. So, and we all know that when we get scared or excited or when we exercise a lot, we can really feel our heart pumping. And the ancients felt that as well. And that's why they attributed to the heart a lot of the essential functions of humanity. Although today we now know that many of those functions reside in the brain. Okay, so this slide really is the justification for our study of the cardiovascular system. We don't spend a lot of time in physiology in this class, right? We cover basic biology, we cover cells and molecules, we talk about evolution and ecology and the environment. We don't spend a lot of time on physiology. This is really our only lesson on physiology. And this is why. Because heart disease is the #1 killer in the US and actually throughout the industrialized world. So that, I think, justifies our study. Note also that the #2 killer is cancer, and we did spend some time talking about cancer earlier in the semester. All right, so, and that's what this graph is showing. It's showing us the major killers in the United States. All right, so these are age-adjusted death rates. Not important what age-adjusted is. Let's just think of them as death rates. And the top line here is heart disease. And then the second line is cancer. All right, so one thing we should note is that heart disease rates have actually come down. They've come down significantly. Cancer rates have not. Recently, we've seen some small decrease in cancer deaths, but nothing like the large decrease in heart disease deaths that we've seen over the past 50 years. All right, so that's very interesting. In fact, cancer might soon exceed heart disease as the #1 killer in the US. But when we're talking about heart disease, we should also consider stroke, because stroke actually has a similar pathogenesis, or similar defects lead to stroke as lead to heart disease. And we're going to see that later on when we go through a couple of slides on heart disease. So it has a similar etiology, as we say. So if we combine heart disease and stroke is the black line here, then we're up over 30% of deaths in the US are due to heart disease or stroke. So that still makes it the #1 killer and still makes it very important to study. Now, one of the textbooks, the Campbell textbook, for some reason says that heart disease is responsible for 40% of all deaths. That is not correct. It's 25%. Okay, so what are we going to learn today? We're going to start with some comparative anatomy and comparative physiology. Okay, so we're going to look at circulatory systems in various animals. And we're going to basically build up to the complexity of the circulatory system in mammals. And then after that, we're going to take a close look at the mammalian heart. All right, not just the mammalian heart, but the mammalian circulatory system, which includes the heart, it includes vessels, as I said before, and it includes blood. So we're going to take a look at all of those. And then finally, we're going to spend a few minutes looking a little bit more closely at cardiovascular disease. Okay, so we start with some comparative physiology. All right, if we look up and down the animal kingdom, what we first need to realize is that some animals do not have a circulatory system. All right, so the first division we can make is between those animals with a circulatory system and those animals without a circulatory system. And as you might guess, it is really the simplest animals that don't have a circulatory system. So here's a sponge, okay, phylum Porifera, and here's a jellyfish, phylum Cnidaria. So these animals are simple enough that the sponge is very porous, as you know, and because it's so porous, all the cells of the sponge are really exposed to the environment. Of course, its environment is the ocean, right? It lives in water, but all of its cells are exposed to the environment. So each cell individually can exchange materials with the environment. So there's no need for a circulatory system. Similarly, the jellyfish has this large gastric cavity, all right, which is in equilibrium with the environment, free to exchange with the environment. And because of that, it brings all of its cells also very close to the environment. So once again, cells can individually exchange materials with their environment directly. Once we get to larger and more complex organisms, we'll see that not all the cells are in direct contact with the environment. Therefore, we need a circulatory system, a go-between, a way to exchange materials between the cells and the circulatory system, and then between the circulatory system and the environment. All right? So the simplest organisms, the simplest animals, do not have a circulatory system. All right, so next, we should consider those animals that do have a circulatory system. And that's pretty much everything else, except for the Porifera and Cnidaria. Everything else has a circulatory system. All right, and so when we talk about animals with the circulatory system, the first thing we should consider is an open versus a closed circulatory system. Okay, so here's an example of an insect, phylum Arthropoda. It has an open circulatory system. What open means is that it has this pumping vessel. Okay, so it does have this one vessel, but that vessel pumps fluid, and that fluid is pumped directly into the body. All right, so this fluid interacts directly with all the cells of the body. That's an open circulatory system. There's only one fluid, and it's pumped out of the vessels. It does not stay within the vessels. Here, we have an example of a closed circulatory system. Okay, so this is an earthworm, phylum Annelida. It has a closed circulatory system. Closed means that the fluid, blood in this case, remains in vessels. Okay, so in this case, the fluid is coming out of the vessels. In this case, the fluid remains in vessels. And then exchange happens across capillary walls. All right, so the blood remains in the capillaries, but the capillaries are thin enough, they're a single cell layer thick, such that materials can exchange between the body tissues and the fluid and the blood. All right, so the blood remains contained in vessels, and those vessels are arteries, veins, and capillaries is where the exchange takes place. And we'll take a closer look at them later on. Okay, so circulatory system versus no circulatory system, closed versus open circulatory system. The next level of complexity that we'll consider is a single circuit versus a double circuit. Okay, so this is a diagram of a circulatory system from a fish, and it has a single circuit. These are circulatory systems from amphibians, reptiles, and mammals, and they all have a double circuit. All right, so let's take a look at this single circuit. Note that the blood is all flowing in one direction. And also remember that this is a fish. So in this case, the blood is pumped through the heart, through the gills, and then where it gets oxygenated. So that's where it changes from blue to red. That's just for the purposes of illustration. blood is normally red. Blood is always red, right? But for the purposes of illustration, we distinguish between blue, low oxygen blood, and red, high oxygen blood. Okay, so in the fish, the blood is pumped through the gills where it gets oxygenated, and then it continues on to the rest of the body, and then back to the heart where it gets pumped again. So that is a single circuit. All right, and note also that the heart of the fish has two chambers. It enters in one chamber, travels to the second chamber, and then gets pumped out. All right, so a single circuit, two-chambered heart. Now, all these other circulatory systems are a double circuit. They're a double circuit because these all exist in terrestrial vertebrates, and terrestrial vertebrates, unlike fish, have lungs, not gills. Right? And when the blood passes across the lungs, it suffers a large drop in pressure. Such a large drop in pressure that it can't get to the rest of the body. All right, so the blood has to pass through the lungs, then it comes back to the heart, gets repressurized, and then travels to the rest of the body. All right, that's the double circuit. Okay, so here we have it. We have, there's also a loss of blood pressure when we pass through the gills, but it's not as extreme. When the blood passes through the lungs, we have a real extreme drop in blood pressure. All right, so blood enters one side of the heart and is pumped out of that side, and that would be the right side. I know it looks like your left, but it's actually the right side of the heart. You have to consider it from the point of view of the person whose heart it is. Okay, so this is the right side of the heart. So blood is pumped, returns from the body to the right side of the heart, and then gets pumped out to the lungs, and it gets oxygenated, and then it returns to the left side of the heart and gets repressurized so that it can now travel through the rest of the body. Okay, double circuit. The next level of complexity is the nature of the heart itself. Okay, as I said, the fish has a two-chambered heart. Amphibians and reptiles have a three-chambered heart, and mammals and birds have a four-chambered heart. All right, the difference between the three-chambered and the four-chambered heart is separation of oxygen-rich and oxygen-poor blood. All right, so in this case, this is an amphibian. We have a three-chambered heart. We have two atria, which are on top, and one ventricle. Note that both the oxygen-rich and the oxygen-poor blood mix in that single ventricle and then get pumped out. All right, so what's being pumped throughout the body is a mixture of oxygen-rich and oxygen-poor blood. In the four-chambered heart, we have complete separation. All right, we have a left side and the right side, so the oxygen-poor blood is on the right side and the oxygen-rich blood is on the left side. And it's only oxygen-rich blood that is getting pumped throughout the rest of the body. So it is a more efficient oxygen delivery system. The four-chambered heart compared to the three-chambered heart is a more efficient oxygen delivery system. And note that this system exists in birds and mammals. And as you may recall, birds and mammals are endothermic. That is, they generate heat in order to maintain constant body temperature. And generating heat means burning calories, and burning calories requires oxygen. All right, so endothermic organisms consume a lot of oxygen and therefore need a more efficient oxygen delivery system, and that is the four-chambered heart. Now, one more thing, we should also look at reptiles. Most reptiles, they're kind of intermediate. They still have a three-chambered heart, okay, so two atria and one ventricle, but there's a partial septum separating those two ventricles. All right, it's actually a single ventricle, but there is a partial septum which partially breaks it into two. All right, whereas in the birds and mammals, we have a complete septum that completely separates this into two separate ventricles. All right, so as I said, it is mammals and birds that have a four-chambered heart. Crocodiles also have a four-chambered heart. All right, so remember, crocodiles are actually more closely related to birds than they are to other kinds of reptiles. So this name reptiles that we give to some animals really doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot. Note also that mammals and birds have different evolutionary origins, okay? So they do have a common ancestor, but some of the intermediates on the way to birds actually had three-chambered hearts. So this is telling us that four-chambered hearts evolved independently at two separate times during the history of life on Earth. All right, so four-chambered hearts evolved in the lineage that led to mammals, and it also evolved separately, independently, in the lineage that led to crocodiles and birds. This lineage would also include dinosaurs. All right, so this is an example of convergent evolution. All right, so when faced with a similar problem, the need to efficiently deliver oxygen, Mother Nature or evolution came up with the same solution at two times, in two independent events. Convergent evolution. Okay, so now that we've covered some comparative anatomy and comparative physiology, we'll move on, but let's do a quick review. Again, we should consider animals with a circulation versus without a circulation. Okay, so circulatory system, yes or no. If they do have a circulatory system, is it open or closed? If it is a closed system, is it a single circuit or a double circuit? If it's a double circuit, is it a three-chambered or four-chambered heart? Okay, so that's kind of four levels of comparative anatomy and comparative physiology that you should be aware of. Okay, so now let's talk more about the mammalian circulatory system. All right, as I alluded to before, there are two circuits, and they are called the pulmonary circuit. Pulmonary circuit means of or having to do with the lungs. Okay, that's what pulmonary means. And the systemic circuit. Systemic, deals with the rest of the body. All right, so it is the right side of the heart that collects blood from the whole body and then pumps it to the lungs where it gets oxygenated. That oxygenated blood returns to the left side of the heart, and then the left side of the heart pumps it throughout the body. All right, so that's the pulmonary circuit associated with the right side of the heart, and the systemic circuit that's associated with the left side of the heart. Now we can also consider a third circuit, the coronary circuit. All right, the heart is a muscle. It's a very active muscle. It needs a lot of energy, needs a lot of oxygen. So it has its own circulatory system, or it has its own blood supply. And technically, it really should be considered part of the systemic circuit because it really does branch off the systemic circuit. But this circuit is big enough and important enough that we give it a separate name, okay? And that separate name would be the coronary circuit. Coronary meaning having to do with the heart. All right, so the coronary circuit pumps blood to the heart, which has a great need of oxygen, and of course returns blood wastes away from the heart. All right, and coronary tells you where we get the term coronary artery disease or heart disease. All right, heart disease is a disease that affects the vessels feeding the heart, or the coronary vessels. Once again, coronary artery disease. Okay, so closer look at the heart. So the heart is, it has a lot that's in common with skeletal muscle. Okay, so in terms of its muscle, it's like skeletal muscle, but it's generally thicker. So we call that, and we call that tissue myocardium, which basically means heart muscle. All right, and for the most part, the myocardium is this thick muscle wall. All right, and note that it's especially thick around the left ventricle because the left ventricle is going to pump throughout the body. It's a little bit thinner around the right ventricle, which only has to go to the lungs and back. And then it's relatively thin around the atria. Here's the right atria, here's the left atrium, because those have to just pump blood into the ventricles. All right, so the heart muscle is called myocardium. And then that whole myocardium itself is surrounded by a membrane called the pericardium. So those are the chambers. We have the right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle. And between them, we have valves. Okay, so these valves go by several different names. I'm going to try to keep it as simple as possible. All right, so this is the valve between the right atrium and the right ventricle. So we can simply call that the atrioventricular valve. All right, there's one on the right side of the heart, and there's one on the left side of the heart. So we can just call it right AV and left AV, but they also have more different names The right AV is sometimes called the tricuspid valve, and the left AV is sometimes called the mitral or the bicuspid valve. All right, but again, to make it simple and consistent, we can just say AV, right AV and left AV. And then there are valves, and these are one-way valves, okay? So they control the flow of blood. And then there are valves between the ventricle and the arteries that they feed. All right, the right ventricle pumps into the pulmonary artery, and there's a valve there, and that's simply called the pulmonary valve. The left ventricle pumps into a different artery, the aorta. The aorta is the largest artery of the body, and here we have the aortic valve. All right, so not too difficult. And then in addition to that, we have, here's a good illustration of the coronary circulatory system. All right, so these are the vessels that feed the heart. And once again, they include arteries that are oxygen rich, and they include veins that are oxygen poor and designated in blue. Okay, so let's talk about the cardiac cycle. So the heart is essentially a pump. All right, so we're going to learn exactly about this mechanical pumping action. All right, so basically we have diastole and systole. Diastole means relaxed. The heart is open. All right, so this first picture is diastole. Okay, both the AV valves are open. The atria and the ventricles are relaxed and open, and blood is flowing into the atria and the ventricles, mostly into the ventricles. All right, so the heart is relaxed, blood is flowing in. That's diastole. Then we have systole. First, we have atrial systole. Okay, so atrial systole means the ventricles are still relaxed, but the atria are going to contract. Okay, the atria contract to pump blood into the ventricles. Okay, so note that the AV valves are still open, and that the aortic and pulmonary valves, or the semilunar valves, are closed. That's atrial systole, and that is followed by ventricular systole. Now the ventricles are contracting. All right, so note that there's a pause between those two things. First, the atria contract, and then there's a pause of 1/10 of a second, and then the ventricles contract. All right, and when the ventricles contract, that's going to close the AV valves. Okay, so blood flow is going to be in one direction, and it's going to open these semilunar valves, so the blood is going to flow out of the heart into the pulmonary artery and the aorta. All right, so that's the muscle contractions, and we have a nice illustration of that on the next slide. All right, so, and it's a little bit gross, but it's also very informative. All right, so you can see diastole is when the heart is open, the muscles are relaxed, and you can see that while the heart is open and these ventricles are maximally expanded, the AV valves are open and blood is flowing into the ventricles. And that's all we can really see here is the ventricles. The atria are back here, and we're not getting a good look at the inside of them. But as the heart is expanding, these AV valves are open and blood is flowing in. And then the ventricles contract. As when the ventricles contract, these AV valves close, so we're not getting any backflow back into the atria. And the semilunar valves are open, so that blood is flowing out into the pulmonary artery in this case, and what you can't see in the back here is also into the aorta. Okay, so those are the contractions of the heart, okay, or the cardiac cycle. These contractions, as you can see, are highly coordinated. When those ventricles contract, the whole ventricle has to contract all at once. All right, so it's a highly coordinated system, and it's highly coordinated because of the electrical impulses that are generated. And we'll get to that in a moment. But first, I'm just going to go over one quick thing, this concept of cardiac output. And again, if you're going into health field, and if you deal at all with the heart, and because it's the #1 killer in the world, you will be dealing with the heart at one point or another. An important parameter of the heart is this concept of cardiac output. Basically, how much blood is the heart pumping? All right, and it's a relatively simple calculation. All right, so we can consider the volume of one ventricle, and that's typically around 70 or 75 mil. All right, so that's how much the blood is going to pump with each contraction. And then we can consider how many times that the heart is pumping in 1 minute. All right, so in this case, a typical heart rate is 72 beats per minute. All right, so if we consider the 70 mil volume of one ventricle times 72 beats per minute, that's about 5 liters of blood per minute at rest. That's quite a bit, right? The heart does a lot of work, 5 liters of blood every minute. What's really remarkable, however, is that this can be controlled. It can be regulated. It can be upregulated. All right, we know that in times of stress or in times of peak exercise, our heart beats a lot faster. Not only does it beat faster, but it expands further and it contracts more strongly. All right, so we're actually increasing the cardiac output for several reasons when we exercise. Remarkably, at peak exercise, this 5 liters per minute can go up to 35 liters per minute. So really remarkable. All right, so that's a quick discussion of cardiac output. The next thing to consider is how the beats of the heart are coordinated and what's driving them. Okay, so for that, we have to consider the electrical impulses that the heart generates and responds to. Now, I said a moment ago that the heart is like skeletal muscle. It certainly has a lot in common with skeletal muscle, but it's also different. It's different in that it kind of has its own nervous system. All right, so the heart is kind of a mixture between skeletal muscle tissue and nervous tissue or neurons. All right, so and that will allow us to discuss the electrical signals that drive the beating of the heart. All right, so the number one thing that you need to learn about the beating of the heart is that it is autonomous. All right, that is, it beats on its own. It does not need any input from the central nervous system. All right, so if we consider skeletal muscles, the ones that, for example, control my hand, those are driven by impulses from my brain. All right, I see some food, I go take it, I use my hand to grab that food and bring it to my mouth. That's all driven by impulses that I initiate from my brain. All right, so we have a skeletal muscles and we have nervous tissue. The heart does not work that way. The heart has its own nervous system, as I said. And that nervous system generates a signal that drives the contraction of the heart. All right, it is autonomous. All right, so let's take a quick look at how this works. So again, there are the impulse begins in a particular part of the heart called the sinoatrial node, or the SA node, and that's depicted right here. And this purple represents the electrical signal traveling throughout the atria. All right, so the signal is going to start here. The signal is going to travel throughout the atria and cause contraction of the atria. So remember, during systole, the atria contract first. And that's driven by this initial electrical impulse. And that can be seen on an electrocardiogram as that blip right there. All right, so then that impulse travels to the next node, which is the AV node, or atrioventricular node. And there it's going to pause for a tenth of a second. Remember that there's a pause between contraction of the atria and contraction of the ventricles. And that makes for more efficient contraction, right? You want to have the ventricles as full of blood as possible before they contract. All right, so that pause is built in here. And then the signal travels from the AV node to the apex. All right, so the apex is that tip of the heart. And from there, it's going to spread throughout the ventricles. And as it spreads throughout the ventricles, it's going to cause contraction of the ventricles. All right, and that's, again, seen in the electrocardiogram as the big spike. All right, so we're not going to get into details of the electrocardiogram, but depending on what you do in your professional life, you might become very familiar with electrocardiograms. They're not that complicated. All right, so this big spike represents contraction of the ventricles. The small spike represents contraction of the atria. And then there's various other parameters, relaxation of the ventricles and so forth. They're, again, if you go into that field, you'll become very familiar with them. They're not that complicated. And we don't need to know them for this class. But we do need to know this order of events and what's driving contraction of the heart, which, remember, is autonomous. Okay, so that's the heart. Now we'll talk about other components of the cardiovascular system, namely the vessels. All right, and there are 3 kinds of vessels. There are arteries, veins, and capillaries. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. Artery A for away. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. And generally, it's going to carry oxygenated blood away from the heart to the rest of the body. There is an exception. The exception is the pulmonary artery, because the pulmonary artery is sending blood to the lungs where it's going to get oxygenated. Other than that, the arteries are going to have oxygen-rich blood. Then the blood travels through the capillaries. We'll get to the capillaries in a moment, and then it returns to the heart in veins. All right, so veins carry blood back to the heart. All right, and here are the structures of arteries and veins, and they both have this three-layer structure, but the arteries are thicker and tougher because the arteries are carrying blood away from the heart, and they're going to be high pressure. All right, so they're going to be a pressurized system. And they have to be tough and somewhat flexible in order to handle that pressure. By the time the blood gets to the veins, then we're in a very low pressure environment, and the veins are not as thick and not as tough. And the veins have one-way valves to make sure that the blood is returning to the heart. So the blood is not pressure driven in the veins. Therefore, we need these one-way valves. And I'll discuss those more in a second. Okay, so in between the arteries and the veins are the capillaries. All right, so here's artery taking blood away from the heart. Here's vein carrying blood back to the heart, again depicted in blue. And in between are the capillaries, and it is the capillaries that are going to travel through all the tissue of the body, and that's where exchange is going to happen. All right, so and you'll see that the capillaries get very small. So arteries and veins tend to be larger vessels. And we go from arteries to arterioles, which are smaller, and they get smaller and smaller until you get to the capillaries. And then those return to venules and then to veins, which get bigger and bigger. But the capillaries themselves are very small, and you can see how small they are here. They're basically one cell thickness in diameter, just enough room for a red blood cell to squeeze through. In fact, sometimes they're even smaller, and the red blood cell has to kind of contort itself to get into all the capillary spaces. And that works because the red blood cells themselves are very flexible. Even though individually the capillaries are very small, there's a lot of them. So if we calculate the surface area of the capillaries versus the surface area of all the arteries versus the surface area of all the veins, we'll see that the capillaries are by far the largest type of blood vessel. Okay, that's where that has the most surface area. Each one individually is small, but there's a whole lot of them to maximize exchange between tissues. All right, and here's an example of that exchange. This is a capillary, and note that the capillary is a single cell layer thick. So the red blood cells carry oxygen. The oxygen can be released here and then travel through the capillary and get to the tissue. Likewise, things like glucose or small molecules like amino acids can diffuse across the capillary wall and get into the tissue. Or the waste products that the tissue produces, like carbon dioxide, can diffuse into the bloodstream through the capillary wall and then be carried back to the lungs. All right, so it is the capillaries where exchange happens. The blood never leaves the vessel. It's always contained in capillaries, but exchange happens across the capillary wall. And here, once again, is a diagram of the veins. So let's back up a little bit and talk about veins again. So veins have these one-way valves because, once again, they are a low-pressure system. So pressure is not enough to drive its travel back to the heart. What happens rather is any kind of movement you do is going to squeeze these veins. And because of these one-way valves, it's going to squeeze the blood back toward the heart. And then the valves close, so there can't be any backflow away from the heart. All right, and that's why if you're sitting for a long period of time, if you're on a long plane flight or a long bus ride or something, it's good every once in a while to get up and walk around so that you can force some of the blood from the lower extremities back toward the heart. All right, and so any kind of movement you do aids in getting blood back to the heart. And the other thing to consider about blood flow through capillaries is that it can be regulated. All right, so a good example is temperature control. All right, when your body gets hot, you start to increase the blood flow to the surface, to your skin, where you can generate sweat and dissipate that heat. All right. And that happens because these capillary beds can be opened or closed. They can't be completely closed because your skin, of course, needs the nutrients in blood, right? But they can be partially closed. All right, so here's an example. So there are these sphincters, precapillary sphincters, and they can close down and prevent some blood flow through some areas of the body. All right, and then there's a thoroughfare channel, which will direct the blood right back to the veins, and it'll go back to the heart without having passed through all these capillaries. All right, so you can increase or decrease blood flow to certain parts of the body. Once again, a good example is temperature control and blood flow to the skin. But also, flow to your muscles will also be regulated, right? When you're exercising, more blood is flowing to your muscles. You can also control blood flow to the digestive system. When you're eating, after you've eaten a meal, there's a lot of blood flow to the digestive system. And when you're not eating, that blood flow is going to be reduced, right? And that's why, it's actually a folk tale, but that's why people say don't swim after you eat, because the blood is busy at the digestive system, and therefore you might not have enough blood to power the muscles to keep you swimming. That's not true at all. If your muscles need the blood, they're going to get the blood. The blood flow to the gut will be sacrificed, and you might get an upset stomach or something like that, but you won't lack for blood flow to the muscles. Okay, and then as I was saying before, this represents the blood pressure in the various vessels. All right, and pressure is high in the arteries, and that's why we can measure blood pressure in the brachial artery, and we can measure a systolic and a diastolic blood pressure. And that drops off as we get deeper and deeper into the arteries. And then we have basically low pressure in the capillaries. So this pinkish part would be capillaries, and then low pressure throughout the veins. And of course, this low pressure in the capillaries promotes exchange. And we can look at velocity in the same way, and it's similar in that as we get further from the heart, it drops off. And then blood flow is very slow in the capillaries, once again, to aid in exchange. And then because of those one-way valves and movements of the body, the rate of blood flow will pick up as we get into the veins and get closer to the heart. Okay, so then the next part to talk about is the blood itself. All right, blood basically has three components. We have the cell-free portion of the blood, which is called plasma, and then we have the cells of the blood, and that's what's shown here, the different cells of the blood. And basically we have red blood cells. Those carry oxygen, and they are by far the most numerous of the cells in the blood. Then we have white blood cells, or cells of the immune system. All right, so cells of the immune system fight off infection, and they respond to injury. And then finally, we have the platelets. Platelets are actually cell fragments, but they cause blood clots. All right, so they respond to a break in any kind of a cell vessel. Platelets are going to migrate toward that break, and they're going to spread out across that break to form a clot and prevent the loss of blood. All right, so basically 3 different kinds of cell types plus the cell-free portion of the blood makes 4 different components. Okay, here it is shown again. All right, we have the cell-free portion, which is called plasma, and then we have the cellular components of blood. And once again, the red blood cells are by far the most numerous. And then in addition to that, we have the white blood cells and the platelets. And then the biggest fraction of the blood, though, is the plasma. And the plasma is mostly water, but it's all the things that dissolve in water, like salts, electrolytes. The blood is high in sodium concentration. Of course, the blood contains glucose. Glucose is water soluble and travels through the blood. Travels dissolved in the blood. Amino acids travels through the blood. But then there's also things like some proteins, hormones dissolve in blood and travel through the blood. And then lipoproteins are a way that lipids are transported throughout the body. Okay, so as we said, red blood cells carry oxygen, and they carry oxygen because they are rich in this protein, hemoglobin. Okay, so this is the protein hemoglobin. It has four parts. It's actually a tetramer. One, two, three, four. And each of those four units contains this small molecule heme. And at the center of this small molecule is iron. And it is the iron that attaches to or coordinates oxygen. All right, so oxygen is bound to each one of these molecules. So one molecule of hemoglobin can carry four molecules of oxygen. And a red blood cell has hundreds of thousands of molecules of hemoglobin. Okay, so hemoglobin is the form that is what carries oxygen in the red blood cells of most vertebrates, but some other animals have other ways of transporting oxygen with different proteins. They're not important. What's important to us is this protein here, hemoglobin. Okay, so the last thing to talk about is coronary artery disease. All right, also known as heart disease, and they are the cause of heart attack. All right, so let's take a quick look at a heart attack. So once again, we have the coronary circuit, right? So the coronary circuit delivers blood to the heart. So these all these vessels are along the surface of the heart, and they start with as coronary arteries, and they of course become capillaries for exchange of materials, and then they return in veins. The blood returns in veins. All right, so a heart attack is basically a blockage in one of these arteries. And of course, if there's a blockage, that means that oxygen and other nutrients are not getting to the tissue that's downstream of that blockage. And that tissue is going to die. All right, and that's what a heart attack is. It's basically a portion of the heart that dies off because of the blockage of blood flow. All right, the technical term is myocardial infarction. That basically means death of heart muscle, myocardial infarction, more commonly known as a heart attack. But it is a blockage that restricts blood flow to certain areas and leads to injury of that area. All right, the cause of coronary artery disease is atherosclerosis. So atherosclerosis is the buildup of plaque in the coronary arteries. They can build up in other arteries too, but they seem to be most consequential when it builds up in coronary arteries. Okay, so here's a picture of a coronary artery without any plaque in it. But here's a picture of a diseased coronary artery with plaque in it. Okay, so this is atherosclerotic plaque. And you can see that it's blocking, to some extent, it's blocking blood flow in this coronary artery. Now, if we take out this plaque, and we've done this, a lot of scientists have been doing this for a long time, you can remove this plaque and you can do a chemical analysis of it. And what you find is cholesterol. Okay, so the major component of atherosclerotic plaque is cholesterol, as well as other lipids and cells and calcium. Now, a heart attack is not simply the buildup of this plaque until it gets to the point of complete occlusion, and then you get heart attack. It's more complicated than that. What you have is you have partial blockage, and then you have some sort of a blood clotting event that closes off the rest of the artery. And that's when you get downstream damage. And of course, that because that's a clot, it can actually be reversed. So the thing is, when you have a heart attack, is to get medical attention as quickly as possible so you can quickly restore blood flow. All right, but this atherosclerotic plaque is the cause of heart disease. And a similar thing happens with stroke. All right, so stroke is also driven by the buildup of atherosclerotic plaque. All right, so that brings us to where we started. All right, and that is cardiovascular disease as the #1 killer in the world, not just the industrialized world, but the whole world. And as I said before, heart disease by itself accounts for about 25% of deaths in the US. And if we combine it with stroke, we're over 30% of deaths in the US. But as I pointed out to you before, the dramatic thing to keep in mind is that we have made great strides against heart disease. The rate of heart disease death and stroke death is actually decreasing, or it has decreased dramatically over the past several decades. All right, so why is this? And there's a whole host of reasons why we've been able to reduce deaths from heart disease. I think most important is the understanding of what heart disease is and this idea of the buildup of atherosclerotic plaque. All right, and that's given us a lot of tools. That understanding has given us a lot of tools to combat heart disease. Okay, and they include surgical intervention, so we can bypass the areas where blood flow is occluded. It includes drugs that reduce the buildup of atherosclerotic plaque. It includes understanding of the role of blood pressure, because blood pressure is going to lead to injury in the heart vessels, and then that the heart's going to respond to that injury and injury by clots, and that's what's going to cause heart attack. So there's a whole host of reasons why we've been able to reduce deaths from heart disease. But what it really comes down to is understanding the risk factors, understanding risk factors for heart disease. All right. So there are those factors that in your life that either increase or decrease the likelihood that you will suffer a heart attack. All right. So those are the risk factors for heart disease. There are some risk factors that you cannot control, completely beyond your control. Age, sex, and genetics are things beyond your control. All right. So age, of course, is an important risk factor for heart disease. The older you are, the more likely you are to suffer a heart attack. That's a very plain and simple fact that you really can't avoid. Sex also has an effect. Men suffer from heart disease more frequently than women. And then, of course, there's the genetics. I mean, if you have a history of heart disease in your family, the odds are pretty good that you're at increased risk of heart disease. Some of these genetics we know very well, and we've covered some of it before. So remember talking about familial hypercholesterolemia, a genetic disease. All right, so some of the genetics is pretty well understood, but some of it is not. There are more than 100 different genes that contribute to heart disease, and we really don't know the effect of all of them. And then there are those risk factors that we can modify, okay? So blood pressure, if you have high blood pressure, that is definitely a risk factor for heart disease, and 1/3 of adults have high blood pressure, but that can be treated. We can look at cholesterol levels, all right, and cholesterol travels in the blood in many forms, including LDL and HDL, and we know that high LDL is a risk factor for heart disease, whereas high HDL protects against heart disease, or low HDL is a risk factor for heart disease. And then the presence of diabetes is also a risk factor. Smoking is perhaps the #1 preventable risk factor for heart disease. Now, we all know that smoking is not good for you. And if you were to ask someone, why is smoking not good for you? The answer they would give, think about this yourself, what's the answer that you give? Most likely, most people would give the answer that it causes lung cancer. Smoking is bad for you because it causes lung cancer. Indeed, smoking does cause lung cancer, and that's bad. But the #1 cause of excess death among smokers is heart disease. All right. So tobacco smoke, nicotine in particular, is toxic to the heart. Alcohol consumption is kind of interesting because we've done a complete 180 on alcohol. So in the past, we used to think that alcohol consumption in moderation is actually beneficial, actually help to prevent heart disease. We no longer think that. We now know that that alcohol consumption, even in moderation, increases your risk of heart disease. And of course, we know a lot about diet and exercise too. We know that a diet that's rich in animal fats is a risk factor, okay, increases the risk of heart disease, whereas a diet that's rich in plant products reduces the risk of heart disease. And of course, cardiovascular aerobic exercise is beneficial in terms of preventing heart disease. All right, so we know about these risk factors, and some of them are things that we can change. So here's what we can do to reduce our risk of cardiovascular disease. If you have high blood pressure, get it treated. If you have high levels of LDL cholesterol, that can be treated. We have very effective drugs called statins that reduce LDL cholesterol. If you have diabetes, get it treated. If you smoke, quit. Limit your alcohol consumption. And then, of course, proper diet and regular consistent exercise are key to protecting the heart. And then we have more intensive interventions. All right, things like cabbage, that's bypass surgery, uh, coronary artery bypass graft. Okay, so bypass surgery. Stenting, so where there's an area of atherosclerotic plaque, you can go in there with a artificial net and open up that artery. So that's called stenting. And then we've learned that some drugs actually reduce the risk that a clot will form and lead to a heart attack. So aspirin is one of them, but there are other blood thinners as well. Okay, so we've come full circle. We've come back to heart disease, and we've had a little discussion of heart disease. But that kind of highlights the importance for studying